If you know me, you know how much I love music, so I think it's only fitting I start with two quotes from two of my favorite artists of all time. The first being from Kanye West. People always tell you, be humble, be humble. When was the last time someone told you to be amazing? Be great, be awesome, be awesome. The second, coming from Kendrick Lamar. Sit down, be humble. I struggled a lot with writing this talk, as I didn't want to stand up here and waste your time throwing myself a pity party. At the same time, I knew I wanted to give a talk, and I knew what I wanted it to be about, so the conflicting thoughts, like these two quotes, made me think a lot about what I have to say. Identity and legacy. I think all of us at some points have struggled with conflicting thoughts in our minds. Talk about myself or sit down and shut up. No one cares what I have to say. Raise my hand in class, or what if I get the answer wrong and everyone thinks I'm an idiot? Even the conflicting opening thought I gave you, I want to talk to you, but what if what they think I have to say is dumb, or that I'm up here trying to give myself an ego boost? The common theme between these thoughts is the perception of those around you, which ties back to my first point, identity. I think we're often led to believe that our identity is the product of what others think about us. If my form thinks I'm popular, then I must be one of the cool kids. If I've done the last 3 productions of theater, I must be a theater kid. These thoughts can often be near the truth, but they can also become incredibly destructive if you base your self-worth and self-perception off of them. I grew up in Idaho, and it was a big change for me coming to school in Pennsylvania. During the first week of football preseason, one of the 6 formers of the team found out I was from Idaho, and thus bestowed upon me the nickname of Idaho. The name stuck, and for the rest of the season, I was Idaho. I took a lot of pride in the name, as I was the only kid from Idaho, so I knew I had to give it a good rep. After one of our final practices, a group of 6 formers pulled me aside and explained to me that there would be a pep rally for our big game coming up, and they wanted me to rap in it. I was shocked, but honored, and knew I could not let them down. As the big day came, I spent the whole day reciting the lines to my rap and psyched myself up for rapping in front of the whole school. The time came for my verse of the song, and as I was handed the mic, I looked at the audience and saw all the faces of the school. As I focused more on their faces, I forgot the words, which I saw had an effect on the emotions of the audience. I watched as faces either turned from pity to laughter as I dug myself deeper into a pit of embarrassment. As I desperately tried to grasp for words in my mind, the best line I could come up with was, "We are going to beat Elville because they are just Smellville." A moment of silence followed, and I knew I'd cemented my reputation and identity as the loser who messed up in front of the whole school. I then heard one kid chant Idaho, then another and another. Soon the whole school was chanting my name as I was carried off the stage by the other football players. From that point on, everyone knew who Idaho was, but no one knew Grant Lupien or who he was. Idaho was just the kid who rapped in front of the whole school. After a year and a half of living the life of Idaho at school, I felt good about who I was and who I was representing. I tied my identity to a name the school had given me because it was easier to associate with an identity given to me rather than creating one for myself. I believe that identity comes in 2 components, however: your present, which for me was the nickname Idaho, and your past, which is your legacy. I always think the concept of legacy is somewhat strange, as it only truly matters after you die, so you won't even experience it. If it's something we can't experience, then why are we so obsessed with it? I believe it comes from the human obsession to be bigger than oneself. In the song "Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst" by Kendrick Lamar, he raps about his need to be thought of even after he's gone. In the chorus of the song, he pleads with the audience, "When the lights shut off and it's my turn to settle down, my main concern, promise that you will sing about me, promise that you will sing about me." For me, legacy has always played a prominent role in my own conception of my identity. My grandfather, William Lupien, has his own Wikipedia page and played a key role in the creation of the online stock exchange. Growing up, I knew my grandfather was somebody, but until recently, I had not been able to fully comprehend the degree to which he was an influence. While it was often a fun party trick to show people my grandfather's Wikipedia page, when at home or with my family, I felt the pressure of his presence. I remember vividly in 7th grade, sitting at dinner with my family when my grandfather told me he wanted me to go to boarding school. My mother had gone to boarding school as well, and my parents had already begun discussions of the idea, but him telling me this meant I had to do it, not only that, but be the best at it. My grandfather pushed me to my limits and helped me become the person I am today, and I knew I could not let him or the Lupien family down. I got into Hill, but I knew the work was not finished. I strived to be the best at everything I did, and even tried new things like playing baseball for the first time ever during my 4th form year. After a long day of JV baseball practice, I received a text from my mother a few weeks before the end of the school year explaining that my grandfather's health was in decline and to keep him in my prayers. My grandfather had an ongoing battle with thyroid cancer, and I had been fighting it for most of my life. I knew the time I had with him was limited, and I hoped that I would be able to see him once the year was over. A few weeks later, I was working on my final project for Spanish when I received a call from my mom in tears. My grandfather had not much time left, and it was time for me to say goodbye. A wave of emotions rushed through my head. Why was I not there? Why am I here at school and my family gets to say goodbye in person? Will he be able to understand what I'm saying, considering he had been close to unresponsive the past few days? I held the phone to my cheek and took a deep breath. I explained to my grandfather how much I loved him and that I'd keep his name in pride. I told him I would continue working to make him proud, even if he could no longer tell me he was proud of me. As I finished, my mother explained that it was the first time he had moved in days listening to my call, and that she believed he had heard me and tried his hardest to make sure he had heard. In the second verse of Sing About Me, Kendrick raps from the perspective of a friend of his who was struggling with her sense of identity and legacy. She had been involved in things she was not proud of, but did not want Kendrick to sing about her on his song. As the verse closes, she tells Kendrick, "And matter of fact that I mentioned I physically feel great, a doctor's approval of a time I know I'm straight. I'll probably live longer than you and never fade away. I'll never fade away, I never fade away, I know my fate." As Kendrick says these words, his voice fades out, and it is implied that she passed away. Before my grandfather passed, my uncle had begun working on a book about my grandfather's life so that his stories and experiences could be remembered forever. Unfortunately, due to many complications, the book was never finished, but his stories live on with me and my family. That same summer, my family explained to me that we would be moving to Florida so that my parents could be closer to me and my brother, who'd be going to boarding school later that year. Everywhere I looked, my identity was crumbling. I was Idaho. Who cares about another kid from Florida? I also lost the person I tried my hardest to impress, and I wondered why I even work anymore. As my family began to pack up my house, I fell into unhealthy habits of self-loathing and isolation that developed into the hardest months of my life. When falling into the trap of self-pity, it's easy to fall deeper and deeper with no intent to get out. The only thing I would do during the summer, besides lay in my room, was go to the gym every day. It was the place where it didn't matter who I was or who I was trying to impress. I was impressing myself and working on myself, and that was all that mattered. The hour and a half I spent at the gym was the only thing I looked forward to, and the only reason I would get out of bed in the morning. Of course, I had my good days and my bad days, and whenever I got to see my friends from Idaho, it would help me forget about the identity crisis I was going through, but only momentarily. Even when seeing my closest and longest known friends, it was never the same. Living at boarding school for most of the year took a toll on our friendship, as they were able to see each other without me. My identity was nothing, as even the relationships I had my whole life were slipping away. The time for football preseason came, and I was excited and nervous as I'd finally get out of the house, but I knew I'd be around people again, and I did not know how to interact with them. I decided to repeat what I had tried my third form year and keep my head low. During my free time in the 2 weeks, I was in my room watching TV. This habit of isolation was something I carried into the school year as well. The Idaho that once loved to go to every social event now stayed in his room and watched TV all day. I convinced myself that this was the only way to feel happiness, as I no longer felt as bad as I did during the summer. I did not allow myself to feel emotions, as I figured feeling nothing was better than feeling bad emotions, even if they came with the good. With this isolation came a lot of time for looking inside myself and building myself up back from nothing. As time went on, I became a part of an established friend group, something I never really had in high school. When the time for the fall dance came, I told them I was going to stay in my room for the night, but, being the great friends they are, made me come, not at the time of my life. This was the turning point, as I had not only begun to recreate my identity, but reintegrate myself back into the social component of school. As time went on, and after careful reflection of the last 2 years, I realized that identity is not something that is set in stone. My friends helped me realize that, and I found it out for myself as well. I did not have to be the same person every day, and that was fine. I slowly allowed myself to feel again and took risks in my life that could end up badly for me. By the time I had got to the 1-year mark of my grandfather's passing, I was completely different, but more whole than I'd ever been. I know who I was and knew that Idaho was not all there was to my identity. I also learned to put aside time for myself, which is something I did a lot of during the summer and fall of the school year. As I brought my identity back, I remembered the concepts of legacy and the importance of it. The two go hand in hand, and you cannot have one without the other. This past spring, I received a call from my mother, who I promised is not only call to tell me bad news, saying that the brother of one of the men I looked up to the most, a close family friend named Kevin, believed that Kevin may have dementia and/or Alzheimer's. Kevin was a detective in San Francisco during the 70s and the lead detective in the Jonestown Massacre. He also worked in the NYPD for a number of years under Giuliani and helped rebuild New York. He could tell stories of his investigations for days, and I always enjoyed spending time with him. I immediately thought back to my grandfather and his unfinished book, and was reminded that Kevin had begun writing his own book about his life. I knew that this time, I could not stand by as another mentor's legacy faded away. I told my mom that I wanted to visit him and help him write his book, and once the school year was over, it was the first thing I did. I stayed with my roommate, who lived close to Kevin, and we both visited him in hopes of helping him finish what he had started. When we drove to his house, however, I immediately knew something was off. His front lawn was overgrown, and the doorknob was covered with cobwebs. I rang the doorbell, and the man who had once had a clean-cut beard and always wore a shirt answered the door with a stained shirt and a beard that reached his chest. He seemed happy, however, and invited us in. As I pulled out my phone to record the stories he was going to tell, I realized the situation was much worse than we thought. He would repeat stories he had already told us, and often had a hard time remembering details to the story he once told with such grace. After a few hours of this, he thanked us for our visit, and we left. We returned again the next day in hopes that it would be better, but I knew in my heart that he was not in the mental state to write a book. As we drove away from his house after the second day, I knew that another man's legacy would once again fade away, as the book would never be finished. Why am I telling you about these books that will never see the light of day? It's not to tell you to find someone to write a book about, but it's more about the preservation of legacy so you do not fade away. Books are not the only way to preserve a legacy, because we as humans are gifted with the power to pass down stories. We all have people in our lives we look up to, people whose legacy means something to us. So, I'm here to ask that you talk to these people, ask them questions, have them tell you stories, because you never know when they will fade away, and it will be too late. I want to end with a quote that's kind of cheesy, but I think it holds a lot of merit and are wise words to live by. This is from J. Cole's Love Yours. Always gonna be a whip that's better than the one you got. Always gonna be some clothes that's fresher than the ones you rock. Always gonna be a girl that's badder out there on the tours. But you ain't never gonna be happy until you love yours. Each day I try and make my grandfather proud without sacrificing my identity and sense of self. Legacy and identity are what make a person, and living in a balance of the two is one of the most important lessons I have ever learned. With all of that in mind, my parting advice to you is this. Live in the moment, but remember where you came from. Create your own identity, but not at the expense of losing yourself. And most importantly, remember to love life, because there's no such thing as a life that's better than yours. Thank you.